Welcome to the Write the Damn Book Already podcast. My name is Elizabeth Lyons. I'm a 6-time author, and I help people write and publish powerful, thought-provoking nonfiction and memoir without any more overthinking, second-guessing, or overwhelm than absolutely necessary. Because let's face it, some overthinking, second-guessing, and overwhelm is going to come with the territory if you're anything like me. I believe that story and shared perspective is one of the most potent ways we connect with one another, and that your story, perspective, and insights are destined to become someone else's favorite resource. For more book writing, publishing, and how the heck do I move through this glitch tips and solutions, and plenty of free and low-cost resources, visit publishaprofitablebook.com. And for recommendations of fabulous books you've possibly never heard of, book writing inspiration, and the occasional meme so relatable you'll wonder if it was created with you in mind, follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth Lyons Author. Hi everybody, and welcome to this next episode of Write the Damn Book Already. This one is a good one. If you are anywhere near my age, you undoubtedly have heard of the perennial bestseller, Tuesdays with Morrie, which was written by Mitch Albom. Morrie Schwartz, about whom the book was written, unfortunately passed away even before that book was released. But his son, Rob Schwartz, unearthed a manuscript that Morrie had written and left in a desk drawer many years after Morrie passed away. And that book has finally seen the light of day as a published book titled The Wisdom of Morrie, Living and Aging Creatively and Joyfully, edited by Rob Schwartz. Rob is a writer, producer, and entrepreneur. His work has appeared in Time, Newsweek, Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, Interview, and Melody Maker, among many others. He was a script editor at NHK World TV in Japan for 14 years, which I loved because I studied Japanese in college and lived there for a little bit myself. And he's been an Asia correspondent for Billboard magazine since 2008. He also produces feature films, including Putty Hill and Bernard and Huey, actively invests in tech-based startups, and is currently a partner in the virtual concert creation platform Mosh Pit. He's also one of the producers of Onetopia, which is an amazing upcoming benefit festival for mental health slated for May of 2024. I loved talking with Rob about his dad, about the moment when he discovered this manuscript, how he decided what to do with it, finding a literary agent to represent it and represent it well, choosing a publisher to publish it and publish it well, and his choice in publishers might very well surprise you. And his incredible passion for continuing to get his father's philosophies and insights on living an incredible life out into the world. With that, let's just get right into the interview. I'm going to start with the question that everyone's asking, and you're probably sick of telling it, but maybe not. I think it's such a fun foundational question, though. Can you tell the story about how you found this thing in the drawer?
Sure. It's a long story, but it actually has two parts. I like to tell the prologue. The prologue is I was traveling, so it goes way back. I was traveling around Asia in the late 80s, and I returned to Boston, to our family home in Newton, in the spring, early summer of 1989. I hadn't lived at home for a couple of years. And my father was working on this manuscript. He was working on a book about aging. He had lots of ideas. And, my father and I talked a lot about everything, intellectual stuff and emotional stuff. So he bounced all of the ideas off of me and we talked about it a lot. And I thought it was great. He was writing the book. And then, he wrote the book for a really long time. It took him like 4 years to write the book. And he was still thinking about editing it and all sorts of stuff like that when he started to get ill with ALS. And he put the book in a drawer. And of course, people know the story from there because of Tuesdays with Morrie. He got sick and he did a lot of talking and a little bit of writing, but not on this book. And then he passed away. And I went back and forth. I moved to Japan, and I went back and forth between Japan and the US and visited my mother in the same house. And the study was there just as he had it with all of his books and his desk. Everything was just, my mother didn't think about moving anything until she sold the house, which was much later. And I'm a journalist, so I was writing some articles, working on his desk. And one day I just pulled open a drawer and there was this big, thick manuscript. I like to emphasize this part because it wasn't just a few like type pages or even just like, type pages. He had bound it with this big black cover. And so it was this really big thing. And I was like, you couldn't tell what it was. It was black, at the top.
Sure.
So I picked it up and opened it up. And of course, I immediately recognized what it was because I had talked to him about it so much while he was writing it. Admittedly, this is, 15 years after that, 14 years after that. But still, I knew what it was. And immediately I thought, okay, I have to do something with this. And, as fate would have it, we have an opportunity to do something with this. If it wasn't for Tuesdays with Morrie, people wouldn't have known who he was. It would have been really hard to get it published. But as it happened, after a lot of process, it wasn't that hard.
Well, and I'd love to talk to you about that process. I have what might be a weird question. Did he type it or handwrite it when you found it bound?
So my father didn't type, but he had written everything with handwriting, but his handwriting wasn't good. And he knew that. So he had hired a typist to type it out. So it's typed. I still have it. I still have it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just amazing. So many of the listeners of this podcast are either aspiring authors or they're published authors and they're working on their next thing. And so I love to talk to people about the publishing journey. A lot of people who listen to this end up self-publishing. Many of them are hell-bent on traditional publishing and getting the agent. I'm curious. I think the assumption would be that it was, and see the air quotes, easy for you to get an agent and then get a publisher for this book. I'm curious what the process was and what your, not concerns, but I imagine you really wanted to honor him with this. And so you wanted it to be a good fit.
Yes, absolutely. There were concerns more on my mother's part than my part. We talked about it for a very, very long time, which is one of the reasons why it took so long. Another reason why the process took so long is that I was in Japan and had a journalism career. Pretty active. I was working for NHK television as a script editor, and I was the bureau chief for Billboard magazine for Asia. So I had a lot on my plate. So the editing process for this book took a really long time. I had to talk with my mother a lot, though my mother was an academic and she had worked on a lot of academic papers. She really wasn't familiar with mainstream publishing, even despite of Tuesdays with Morrie, which she wasn't really involved with. So we had to have a lot of meetings and, talk about things. And it took a long time, and it actually took so I should say a good amount of time to find the right agent. Initially, I found some people where I didn't think the fit was perfectly right. And I have to say, I was lucky in that I had a friend who was very well connected in the industry. And she said, I think I know some agents that would be right for this. And in fact, the first person, and these are very famous agents, so I'm not going to say their names, but the first person that she introduced said no, and I was surprised.
Really?
But the second one she introduced said yes, and then we moved forward from there. And these people, these are extremely famous agents. These are like mega stars in the agency world. So, the person who turns it down, that's, she has an incredible career, whether she does this book or not.
Right.
But the guy who took it did an incredible job with it. And I think he found the perfect publisher. It's always hard to say if I had gone with Simon and Schuster or some really huge publisher, what would have happened. But Blackstone is more of a boutique publisher. This is their most important book of the year. So they put a lot of resources into it. And it's a very, down home operation. I can walk into the office. Everybody knows me,
Right.
So yeah, it feels great. It really feels great.
Was that really important to you? This is just so interesting to me because the big five or the big four now come up all the time as the desired publisher, right?
Sure.
And there are a lot of boutique traditional publishers popping up who are really creating amazing partnerships and making their authors feel so at home and so welcome. And I'm just curious about how you made that decision. Was it easy or?
Well, first of all, when you say the big four, let's run through them because my background is in music and film, but I think so Simon & Schuster.
Right. HarperCollins. Penguin Random House.
I would call it Random House, but yeah.
Random House, okay.
Random House, yeah. And
Hachette.
Right, but Hachette, Little Brown, but aren't they mainly a European publisher? I guess
they are. They do
a lot in this country too.
No pun intended, still considered Big Five.
Right.
And Macmillan.
Macmillan, right.
Yeah. Okay. And then when Penguin Random House was going to acquire Simon & Schuster, that's kind of how they would have become Big Four. But
right. But that was rejected, right?
Correct.
They didn't allow that. Yeah.
Right.
So to answer your question, I mean, I hope this answer is okay because it's one of those things where like, I can't really say. I went with a little publisher and they're doing a great job. But if I had gone with Random House and they had made this one of their important books, well, hell, I mean, they have an incredible reach. I mean, I have to say, and I don't think that my publisher is doing a bad job. I think they're doing a fantastic job. But I go into bookstores whenever I can. I travel a lot. I haven't seen my book in an airport bookstore, right? So, I mean, I don't think that they're doing a bad job. I think it's just the reach of the big four, the big five is stronger, and that's the advantage that you have going with those publishers.
It's very fascinating to me. It really is, because I think, when people are on the outside, they just don't know what they don't know. And so again, it all comes down to assumptions. And with the incredible popularity, I mean, it was a runaway Tuesdays with Morrie. It still is, right? The assumption is that you would just kind of send out an email and everyone would be clamoring. And so I think that helps to give people who are in the space of, it's their very first novel or their very first book, some level of comfort that at every level, it can be a little tricky.
Absolutely. And I mean, I hope that all my publicists and publishing house would be okay with me saying this, but yeah, it wasn't like that. I mean, it wasn't there weren't offers, but there weren't as many offers as I expected. Let's put it that way. And the problem here, or, if you call it a problem, just the situation is the time factor. If we had done this in 2005, it would have been totally different because Tuesdays with Morrie was on everybody's lips. I mean, Tuesdays with Morrie was in the Simpsons movie, It was just like Will and Grace did a whole Tuesdays with Morrie episode, where they mention it by name. It was totally different in terms of the public and the media, back then. But, now it's like that's 2005 is already 18 years ago. Yep. And the book was published, 20 plus years ago. So I think it's the time factor. Like this may be a little bit surprising to you as a publishing literary person, but I have talked to people who don't know Tuesdays with Morrie in the United States. No, I mean like 15 years ago, I could not find anybody over the age of 12 who didn't know the book. Now you can find a lot of people.
I mean, it's surprising and yet not, because everybody isn't known by somebody. I kind of feel that way. Although interestingly, I have twins and they're 21. And that one of them was here the other night. And I mentioned that I was going to be speaking with you. And I mentioned Tuesdays with Morrie. So he wasn't even born. And he said, oh yeah, I started that last year. And because a lot of colleges recommend it. So, it's,
so it is totally a generational thing. If you're over 40, you almost assure in this country and you're, in any way educated, you almost assuredly know the book. If you're under 20 or 25, it's really a matter if your high school or college made it required readings, and a lot do. So it's not that nobody does, but a lot don't, so yeah.
How is that? I imagine it's a little bittersweet for like, one of the things that as I'm not finished with the Wisdom of Morrie yet, but I'm into it and I'm loving it. And I have to say that I bought it just because the minute I heard about it, I bought it. I did not know when I bought it that it was intended for aging, which I technically, I guess, am.
But much like your father, I don't want to admit that.
Well, it's not that he didn't want to admit it. We'll get into that later. I'll tell you the stories around that. But, it's certainly he wrote it with that in mind.
Yeah.
But when I talk about it, and as you know, I've talked about it a lot, I say that it's really suitable for any person because he's really talking about how to live a more creative, vibrant life. And I mean, don't we all need help on that, no matter how old you are?
All day.
Yeah. Right.
All day. And I've even dog-eared some stuff because I'm kind of underlining quickly because it's just so, there's one line. Is that okay if I share a line?
Sure.
In this feeling my age and feeling ageless. The minute I read that section heading, I thought we understand each other. But he said, I recognize with a slight shock that I really don't believe how old I am. And when I do believe it, I want to forget it. And I thought, yes.
He's being very honest there. I'll tell you a couple of stories, one about the book and one just about my dad. So yeah, my dad did always feel that way, not only to himself, but the people around him. I mean, I have a specific story. We had a memorial for my father at the house. We had a public one at Brandeis University, but we had a memorial for my father at the house. And one of my cousins on my mother's side, but so not a direct blood relative of my father, but somebody my father was very close to because he's very creative. He's a musician and an artist and a poet. And that, always spoke to my father, spoke at the memorial, and he got up and the first thing he said was, Morrie always seemed ageless to me. Oh. And it's like, it was like hitting, because the guy is very perceptive. It was like hitting the nail right on the head. So about this book, in the beginning of the book, I mean, you'll recognize like the first couple of chapters, my father talks about how he never viewed himself as an aging person, as an elderly person. And he was forced to face that by his forced retirement at Brandeis, which is not the case anymore. They don't do that anymore. At age 70, they pushed him out. They tried to push him out before that, 65, 68. He said, no, I'm good. And then at 70, he was perfectly capable of teaching. His students loved him, but they forced him to retire. And he had to look at it and say like, wow, society views me this way. I don't view myself this way, but society views me this way. And then he takes this one step further, as I'm sure you've read in the book, and says, why do I not want to view myself that way? And then he realized that we have this ageist, stereotype and, negative attachment to aging, and he figured out how poisonous and wrong that is. Mm-hmm. People who are aging have so much to contribute to society and to the people around them, so much experience, so much wisdom, and this idea that they should just go away and leave us alone is just so incredibly wrong. He even creates this word, which I think you've probably got through this chapter already, with age casting. Mm-hmm. Which comes from the typecasting of actors. He says, elderly people are cast into a role of useless, which is just completely absurd and so wrong. And so once he approached that, so the book in some way follows his thought chronologically. Once he understood that, he's like, I need to try and help people realize this is wrong, and also try and help them, give them techniques that they can do and things they can do if they're feeling that way, if they're feeling, uncreative or detached or, defeated or something like that.
Well, yeah, I loved how he kind of boiled it down to, and I might be incorrect in the number, but like 5 or 6 things that he made sure that he consistently did: exercise, spending time with friends, that kept him vibrant.
Yes.
And they're very simple things that everyone can do at virtually any age.
Absolutely. And they're also about values too. Yes. That's the thing. The values are interwoven, and this is the strong connection with Tuesdays with Morrie, right? His values come through in Tuesdays with Morrie, and the values here, it's like, maybe you can start a second career and make a whole lot more money. Let's say if you're an investor or something like that. And he wouldn't be against that. And of course, if you have a second career, you're going to be, very active. But for my father, creating connections with other people was what he felt was going to keep you young and vibrant and creative and happy and stuff like that. So if you shut yourself up in an office and are trading all day on a computer, I mean, if that makes you happy, then my father would say, okay, if that's your interest, that way I think you're okay. But for him, and what he suggests is that you really try and make connections with people, strengthen the connections with your friends and family. Those are the values that come through.
Well, and I think I often talk about how there will be a line in a book or a perspective that someone will have that will strike you suddenly as a reader, and you'll take it with you and it will stay with you. And so one of his that I love so much is when he said, "Today, it's quite clear to me that the best age of my life is the age I am living, creating, and experiencing now."
Yeah.
And I'm a mom, I have 5 kids. And so people will often ask parents, what's the best age and what's the worst age? And my answer is all of them.
Right. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I thought that was such a poignant way to think about not having to assess, my best days are behind me, but my best days are now.
Right.
And whatever.
I mean, that's a challenge, I think, to really keep that mindset. We have such a youth-oriented society, right? And this book is obviously trying to be like a wedge against that. It's like, yeah, youth is great too, but having experience and knowledge and understanding of the world is a pretty great thing too. I mean, this comes up in Tuesdays with Morrie as well, where my father says to Mitch, like, I wouldn't change ages with you, and Mitch is really surprised, right? It's basically the same idea. And I think that that's a challenge for all of us to feel like, yeah, the age that I am now is the best. In other words,
perfect,
all of the
right.
best. Yeah, your life is
perfect
just
is a
great
terrible word
at any age, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a while between when you found the manuscript and when it was published, correct?
That's right.
How did that sit with you? Did you feel antsy about that, or?
It's funny you should ask that question. You're actually the first person who's put it that way. And the answer is a little bit, not because I hadn't gotten it published and, that made me feel bad, but rather it has to do with the publishing world and things you're very familiar with. And, we see everything turning to digital. I was in the music industry, the CD industry disappeared. It's all digital now. It's all streaming. Cinemas are disappearing. I love the cinema. We still have them, but I wouldn't be surprised if they disappear in my lifetime, right? Yeah. They're going digital, streaming, just like music. And I was just a little worried. It's like, did I miss the window for this to be an actual book that people can hold in their hands? But apparently I didn't. So that
no, you didn't.
I didn't. Thank God.
But
that made me a little antsy. But the rest of it, not so much. I mean, I knew that the book was very valuable. I also knew it needed a lot of editing, and we haven't talked about that yet. And of course we will, because that's the focus of your program, but it needed a lot of editing. So it wasn't just like I could take the manuscript and turn it over, not in the least. It needed a tremendous amount of editing. I think I edited it 5 different times.
Okay.
And I also wrote some essays, which actually was the suggestion of my agent. And I thought it was a great suggestion because, the book was written a long time ago. So I tried to put people in that perspective, but also, suggest that it's extremely relevant for today, and also give some information about my family in the essays and my mom, who was very important for me editing this book and very important for all of my father's academic work, which she edited.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I guess you haven't got the final essay in the book.
I have not.
Talks about that. It's the very end.
Okay.
Talks about that. Yeah.
Oh, how fascinating.
My father had 3 academic books, the first of which was a huge watershed and made his academic career. That's in the first essay I mentioned, that the mental hospital. My mother edited that. The other 2, she wasn't given credit for that one. The other 2, she's specifically given credit for. And the third book they wrote together. So her name is on it as an author.
Okay.
But yes, she edited all of my father's work. She was, my mother was like very concise and clear thinking and organized and, wrote effective sentences and was just like, that was her mindset. And my father was really like a philosopher and, had all the big ideas and sometimes was, not so precise in things. Okay. So they were a good match that way. And my mother was very helpful for me to edit the book. In fact, she edited a few pages and said, this is how it should be done. Now go edit the rest of the book. That's the first time I've actually told anybody that.
I love that. And it actually raises another question for me, which is, because the book was written so long ago, were there references to things that you felt like you either needed to remove or change? For example, like a rotary dial phone, or did
wasn't written that long ago.
Okay. Well, listen, I used to use a rotary dial phone.
In the 90s.
So I'm just saying that was the first. I don't know why that was the first thing that came to mind, but it was.
No crank cars back then.
I
No
used to
rotary
have that
phones.
too, Rob. Okay, I had to crank the windows down. But do you know what were there?
I know what you're talking about. But surprisingly, and maybe this is, a tribute to my father's prescience, but surprisingly, no, I didn't find any references where I'm like, oh, people aren't going to get that.
Okay.
There's a lot of, as you probably know, since you're reading it, there's a lot of different things in the book. There's stories and poetry and newspaper articles and magazine articles. But surprisingly, they all seem extremely relevant and fresh. I mean, they're all written 30 years ago, and they all seem extremely relevant and fresh. So, yeah, I didn't find any reference where it was like, oh, people aren't going to get it.
I was just curious. I mean, being a very philosophical person, right? It transcends time.
Yes.
So everything of which he speaks truly is relevant, regardless of time and regardless of age. And that's why I think this works so beautifully for anyone reading it. It's truly not, I hear what maybe his intention was, but it really is a universal message.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think so too. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's helped me for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and so lots of times when people are raised or they grow up in a certain experience, and let's just call it an extraordinary experience, and then someone says, you should write a book on that. And they think, why? Like, this is my normal. For you, did you know, or at what point did you come to recognize he's so beloved to you and you have such adoration for your father? At what point did you come to recognize this is, just an incredible human?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is not going to surprise you, but I'll tell you anyways. I mean, as a child, as an adolescent, and as a teenager, you're not going to think those things, right? That realization of a mature adult. So I can't tell you exactly what year, came to terms with that, but that's a mature adult. That's somebody who's got to be at least in their 20s. I have stories.
Were you using a rotary dial phone, though? That's really the question.
Exactly. We bought my father, towards the end of his life, one of these push button phones that had the huge buttons. So it made it really easy for him to dial. And we have a lot of video footage, actually. I shot a lot of video footage of my father after he got ill because we knew he wasn't going to be around. He's always using a wireless handset, right? I mean, it's not a smartphone, but it's connected to a landline, but it's wireless, right? So we did wireless back then.
It was that far back. Right.
Yeah. But I have actually a lot of stories about like students coming up to me because my father was a university professor. Mm-hmm. And when I was a kid and saying, oh my God, your father's so amazing. I wish I had had a father like him. And as a kid, you're going to go like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. There's this, that, and the other thing. But in retrospect, you realize, well, they were actually right.
Yeah. Yeah. But how beautiful that you do realize it in retrospect, because I don't think everyone necessarily does. I think that's really lovely.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that, but it was definitely a realization for me. And, we had a wonderful relationship. My father and I never, ever fought. And he, as you can imagine from reading this and Tuesdays with Morrie, he was very accepting of, what I wanted to do. And he didn't impose a lot on me. He certainly didn't expect me to become like a doctor or a lawyer or a university professor, which, both of my parents had been more or less. My mother was working at university with a PhD. She wasn't actually a professor, but no, he didn't impose any of those things on me. The one thing, and it wasn't like he pushed back against it, I just knew about it. The one thing that he wasn't super happy about was that I moved so far away. he didn't mind that I moved to another culture, but Japan is really, really far away. They did come and visit though. My mother came many, many times. My father came once.
Yeah, I actually, it's kind of an interesting, my undergrad is in Japanese and I never talked to anyone who, I mean, barely, who relates to that. So I didn't live there for terribly long, just a few months, but what a wonderful experience that was.
We won't speak in Japanese because
no, we're not going to do that. No.
I like the serious look on your face when I said, please don't speak in Japanese.
Do not. I understand more than I can produce, but don't be there either.
I lived there for a long time, so
And that's the best way to learn it.
Oh, absolutely.
To fully immerse yourself in it.
Without a doubt. I mean, survival. You need people. A lot of people don't speak English. You need to communicate with them.
Yes. And a lot of Motrin. That was part of my survival. A lot of Motrin. There was a lot of concentrating going on. Sure. How did you decide how to put all this together? Like to put the essays in, to put the, all the kind of the extras in amidst, I'm imagining that wasn't in his original manuscript. Those were not in there.
The only thing that wasn't in his original manuscript was my 2 essays. Everything else was in it.
Wow.
So there was actually things my mother and I discussed, and I thought very heavily about what we were going to take out. So we cut certain things down, but everything is in there that is, from the introduction after my essay until the final essay is my father's. I didn't add anything. People ask that, like I didn't add anything, and I didn't radically change any of his sentences or his sentence structure or anything. That was key. I think you'll understand this, to keep his voice, and he has a very unique voice. I had to cut out a lot. Some parts were repetitive. He wrote it over a very long period of time. If he said exactly the same thing 100 pages earlier, then, I would cut it out. He made lists that were too long, stuff like that. There's one chapter that we were unsure about that got cut actually. But for the most part, that was my job. And some parts had to be smoothed out. A lot of research had to be done as well, because, there's so many references. We had to get all the references. He uses so many literary writers and poets and philosophers he's quoting and stuff like that. And they're all, easily understandable. It's not academic, but we wanted to have the right, so people knew who he was, who he was quoting,
Well, what I think is interesting is I've obviously never heard his voice audibly, but I can hear it. I mean, I don't know if what I'm hearing is true to what it was, right? But there's just this kind of sense of spirit that might sound odd, but that comes through.
It doesn't sound odd at all. I mean, this is a very interesting phenomenon that we all do. When you read a book and then that book gets turned into a movie, and the actor is playing the character that you love, and you either think like, yeah, that's what I thought they would sound like, or no, they don't sound like they did in my mind. That's a weird phenomenon as well. But I will add, and to tell you the truth, I'm a little surprised to hear you say that, because I don't know if you were, paying attention to it at the time, but, my father did 3 Nightline programs in 1995 with Ted Koppel. The first one is what Mitch saw, that he reconnected with my father after 17 years. And these Nightline programs are all on YouTube. So you can go.
I've not seen them.
Well,
I'm going to now, but
just put in Ted Koppel, Nightline, Morrie Schwartz, and there's 3 of them. And they will pop up. So it's an hour and a half, totally talking about voice, because they do them progressively as my father gets sicker and sicker. So the third one is not his natural voice at all. He's very but the first one is very much like his natural voice, and the second one is a little bit in between. But if you're interested, you can go on.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I mean, it's interesting. I have a friend, Neely Alexander, whose first novel just came out a couple of months ago, and it was done in Audible. And she said, I'm having such a hard time listening to it for exactly the reasons you just mentioned, because in her own head as the author, she did not imagine the voices sounding, and the narrator did a bang up job. I mean, did a really great job, but nevertheless, it just doesn't quite sound. There's a piece of me that almost, I want to finish the book first and then go listen, because I love the voice that I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I have this.
That's the way we are. That's totally the way we are. And like the film example I used. And in this case, I chose the person who read, there is an audiobook, and I chose the guy who read it, Steven Weber, and he has a fantastic voice. He doesn't have my father's voice, but he has a fantastic, expressive voice. And I think he did a wonderful job. I read my own essays, and I can't listen to that. I can't listen to myself read them. That's just too difficult.
Well, most of us have a hard time listening to ourselves. I just think it's remarkable that, we live in sort of a day and age where the publishing industry has taken an interesting turn, right? And so there's so much accessibility now, which is great. And it's also opened the door for a lot of people who just want to whip out a quick book, thinking they're going to make a quick $1 million, and it's a vanity play. And I love that he just clearly was so committed to and dedicated to exploring his own thoughts about these things. And then so honestly and with comfort, expressing them with the hope that they would make their way to someone else. And it just, for him to have not, I'm of the belief that he probably sees it now, but for him to have not seen it in life, oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's paradoxical. It's
right.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that and I tell people this a lot. I mean, my father didn't even see, or in this form, if you like, Tuesdays with Morrie. He never saw a word of it. He knew that Mitch was writing it. Mitch got the book deal before he passed away, but Mitch didn't write one word while my father was still alive. So he never got to see the huge success of that. And that's one question I get all the time. And I actually love talking about it. People were like, oh, would he have been, shy in the spotlight? My father would have loved it. The spotlight. He was an absolute ham. I mean, he used to, of course, teach in front of students, but he also did like talking tours arranged by the university and stuff, very small, but he wasn't famous. But on things that he knew about. Oh, he would have loved it, so, and I'm sure
so evident
he would have loved that I have, what's that?
It's so evident that he just loves people.
Yeah, exactly. And he would have, I'm quite confident he would have loved the fact that, we finally got this book out and, I'm doing everything I can to get people to know about it. Yeah.
Well, what a gift. So thank you. Thank you for talking to me about it. Thank you for sharing yourself. Thank you for sharing your father with all of us, because what an incredible, incredible gift. I'm so glad it didn't stay in the drawer.
Yeah. I mean, this one, we can maybe end on this note. I mean, this was something, when I found it, that was my feeling. And it was, I'm not going to say it's odd, but it was a little surprising to me that everybody around me didn't feel exactly the same way, right? There wasn't any tension or anything, but we were like, oh, he wrote it a long time ago. Maybe it's because they didn't read it. It's pretty thick.
Oh.
Again, it's like, yeah, this is valuable, and but I was obviously really excited about it, and it was a long-term project. I'm glad. In some ways, I feel, if you're Jewish, you understand this. In some ways, I feel like, I should have done it quicker. I should have done it better, whatever. Could have been done a long time ago. But in another way, I feel that it's some way the timing is really right for today, because we live in this society now that is so isolated. People are so isolated from each other. Everyone has got their head, glued to their phone. And my father is really the counterpoint to that, is talk to people directly, make connections with them, make new friends, take an interest in other people, take an interest in things you don't know about, and find people who are interested in the same thing as you, all of those things are about making connections with other human beings.
I think the timing is impeccable.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It's kind of like the adage, life is lived forward, but learned backward. Right. And I think when you're working on it, it can feel like, oh my gosh, I want it now. I want it now. I want it now. But then when it finally comes out, when it does, you start to understand why it all worked out the way that it did. And I just think the timing is impeccable.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy too. I mean, it's out there. It also looks great. I have to say, this is a bit of I'm going to take a little bit of credit for this, but I was really interested in a certain artistic look for the book, and the artistic designer just did a fantastic job. I wanted it to be bright and colorful. Color runs all the way through the book. It's not just the cover.
Right.
There's different pages in the book, and there's different typefaces. Parts of it look as if they're handwritten. That's something that I wanted. I wanted it to really feel very intimate.
It does. It feels very creative.
Right.
It has personality.
That's the idea.
Yes. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, this is your friendly reminder to follow or subscribe, leave a quick review, and share it with someone you know has a great story or message, but isn't sure what to do next. Also, remember to check out publishaprofitablebook.com for book writing resources and tips, and to see all the ways we can work together to get your book out into the world. Again, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk with you again soon.